Hello all, thank you for joining Duke Science and Society for the first of our coronavirus conversations. My name is Tim McDermott and I am the events manager of Duke Science and Society. Just a few housekeeping notes before I hand it over to our moderator for today's conversation. The chat is open and we encourage you to post questions you would like the expert panelists to address. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout and we will try and get as many of those questions in as possible. Secondly, the goal of these conversations is to gather together in an informal setting to discuss the science and tech issues affecting society and to ensure accurate information is being made available to all in this time of social distancing and remote work. In that spirit, we encourage all attendees to share the ideas and proposals presented today and in all of our future events widely. If you would like direct quotes or if you intend to share the information and ideas presented here with direct attribution to our experts, I do ask that you reach out and connect with me directly so that I can put you in contact with them. Finally, should we experience any technical difficulties during this event and you lose connection in the meeting, it's not a problem. You just go right back to your email and you can rejoin the event without an issue. So at this point, that's all the housekeeping I have. I'm going to turn it on over to my moderator. Andrew Parasek is the editor of SciPol.org. He holds a Master's of Environmental Management from the Nicholas School of the Environment here at Duke. So Andrew, whenever you're ready, please take us away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tim. And really glad to see our big audience here today. Again, welcome to everybody. Just for some additional quick context about our conversation before I introduce our two speakers. So at SciPol.org, which I, of course, encourage you to visit and to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Duke SciPol, we track and explain various federal level science and technology policies that are currently making their way through government. By doing this sort of policy tracking, we keep ourselves informed of big trends and changes in the policy landscape, enabling us to identify areas where further evidence-based policy responses may be needed. So we've been keeping tabs on the coronavirus disease crisis since it was initially identified in China late last year. As the number of infections continued to increase, we recognized through our policy tracking efforts how the current state of the internet and its associated technologies have perhaps uniquely contributed to this virus's spread, both in terms of health, but also in terms of information. In fact, the World Health Organization in early February described this crisis as an infodemic, which they described as such, quote, an overabundance of information, some accurate and some not, that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it, unquote. So this applies to information and claims posted on websites and social media, whether that's from official sources or from your Facebook friend from high school, but that could also apply to internet censorship. Information posted online could also enable, and for the COVID crisis has enabled, digital epidemiology, which is using digital sources to conduct traditional epidemiological work. Or as one scholar has defined it, using data that was not generated for the primary purpose of doing epidemiology. While this approach has been a useful tool in tracking the changing conditions associated with an emerging infectious disease, there are questions such approaches raise regarding, for instance, privacy, ethics, and trust. So recognizing all these factors that the COVID-19 crisis has illuminated regarding the role of online information and seeing an opportunity for policy to address them, my colleagues, Dr. Brian Langloss and Sarah Rispin Sedlack, co-authored a policy brief that they titled Information Sharing During an Epidemic, Policies and Best Practices. This policy brief is freely available on the SciPol.org website, and I encourage you to download and read it, but we will spend time in today's discussion reviewing that brief and going over their suggestions. Of note, while some of their policy recommendations could apply to this current crisis, they also set out to make long-term recommendations that will hopefully help society be better prepared to respond to whatever the next epidemic may be. So to introduce my colleagues, Dr. Brian Langloss is a lead policy analyst here at SciPol.org, overseeing the development and publication of our content related to health policy and data security policy. In addition to working for SciPol.org, Brian also serves on the City of Durham's City Advisory Committee, which is a city council appointed body that provides oversight for Durham's federally funded low-income housing programs. A chemist by training, he received his Ph.D. in chemistry from Duke University in 2018, where his research was focused on the practical application of nanomaterials to biological imaging and radiation detection. Prior to graduate school, Brian completed his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry at the University of California, Riverside, and worked as a research and development chemist in industry. For this policy brief, Brian mostly focused on topics related to mis and disinformation, as well as social media. And Sarah Rispin Sedlack, JD, is also lead policy analyst here at SciPol.org, overseeing the development and publication of our content related to energy policy. She is jointly supported by the Duke Initiative for Science and Society and the Duke University Energy Initiative. She has extensive experience in administrative and environmental law. She received her JD from the University of Chicago Law School, where she was on the board of the University of Chicago Law Review and was a member of the Chicago Journal of International Law. Prior to law school, Sarah lived in Hong Kong for 4 years, where she served as a writer and editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit, EIU, covering China. She holds a double degree in mathematics and Chinese history from Williams College. And for this policy brief, Sarah mostly focused on topics related to censorship and digital epidemiology. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Brian and Sarah. And maybe Sarah, if you want to start. At a broad level, could you each spend some time kind of reviewing some of your key takeaways and recommendations that you discussed in the policy brief? And once we go over those key recommendations and takeaways, we'll go into some questions from myself and from our audience. So I'll turn that over to Sarah.
The main findings that that I contributed to in this brief, I can summarize this way. First is that censorship and a closed information loop cost us valuable time and information in combating this epidemic. That it tells us that the international community and the public health community together should contribute to supporting a framework for an open, accessible internet, which will bolster our ability to deal with this and future epidemics. And that that governments should take a serious look at funding and otherwise supporting digital epidemiology projects that are effective and show accurate results to combat this and future epidemics. And that we also, given just the enormous volume of data sharing that is going on right now in efforts to combat the epidemic and that could be used for future digital epidemiology projects, that we need to look seriously at developing a data sharing framework that allows tech companies to safely and in a privacy protective way share important information with epidemiologists and government officials, but at the same time is time limited and strongly protective of individuals' privacy. So if I may just go back a couple steps on what I mean on those fronts. The first, when we're looking at how censorship and a closed information loop cost us time and information that would have been valuable for fighting this epidemic, the first is pretty obvious to all of us now, that China, as exhaustive reporting efforts have shown, dragged its feet in letting the world know about this epidemic, even though it had frameworks in place internally for identifying and reporting out, and even though it had formal international obligations under the international health regulations to share the news of a novel virus with pandemic potential with the World Health Organization. And not only that, so that cost us, depending on how you look at it, 3 weeks to a month of time in December and January. But not only that, it's now becoming fairly clear that China has been suppressing reports of the full numbers of cases, that it has been suppressing, or in the way that it did so, it has cost us valuable information about the full spectrum of affected individuals. So for instance, China's definition of somebody who had COVID-19 was extremely limited, was and is extremely limited to just those who have both full-fledged symptoms and a positive test. That has led to a vast undercount and has also obscured the data that we're now seeing as it moves through Western countries, that most that most of the people affected by this virus are in fact not elderly. So for instance, in my home state of Maryland, 71% of the people who have tested positive for COVID-19 are under age 60 at this point. They have also been underreporting deaths as international reports have shown. So we were unable to get a full picture of the seriousness and the rapid spread of the virus when it might have counted for more. That is not to say that there haven't been failings in Western countries, that there haven't been failings in our own country, but that did cost us serious time and valuable information. There are also extraordinary opportunities presented by an open internet. We are sharing information like we never have before. Scientists are collaborating in warp speed around the world, and we have been able to pick up on important information through crowdsourcing. So for instance, the understanding now that loss of sense of taste and smell is a symptom, an early symptom associated with COVID-19 is something that has been picked up by epidemiologists through crowdsourced data. So what this points to is that we need to the extent we can, bolster the ability of people in China, in Russia, in Iran, and even in Western countries to surface important information about emerging health threats and to surface information that they may not even know is important about emerging health threats, and access full information available on the internet about those threats. And I think that's a good segue to my colleague Brian's work for this brief on the role of the internet in spreading good information and the pitfalls that we have seen with respect to the spread of misinformation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess that kind of dovetails into what I kind of focus on in the brief, which is really how tech companies, internet, social media, and all these things can be very useful for sharing information, how people use them early on to kind of circumvent some of the censorship issues Sarah had mentioned. And so a lot of the positives that have come out of social media. And then the flip side of that, while there are a lot of positives, we've also seen a lot of attempts to use social media in these kind of disinformation campaigns, spread confusion and false stories about the origin of the virus, things like that, share fake cures, kind of convolute or add confusion to how serious it is. And so there's a lot of kind of negative uses and impacts of social media as well. And so a lot of what I focused on for that was how do you actually combat this misinformation? How do you kind of use the use the kind of utility and power of the internet and social media for positive things while mitigating some of the negative aspects. So and that was kind of my focus within this policy brief.
Cool. Thanks very much. So Sarah, just to follow up on something, we had an audience question come in that was wondering about, since you talked a lot there about China, are there any of the other countries, other than China, that are suppressing information on who has COVID or who might be dying from it? I think you were alluding to a few other countries there, but could you explain a little more about kind of some of those other countries from some of the work you've done?
So hold on just a second. If you'll excuse me, I am going to close my chat screen. So yes. So China is not the only country that has suppressed information. Iran was a country that we were watching early on where there was an outbreak that began most likely in late January or early February, that was only surfaced by authorities in late February. And by the time they had surfaced that outbreak, it was spreading around the Middle East. And there's a whole circle of countries in its immediate vicinity who were experiencing outbreaks, the timing of which showed that it had certainly been spreading in Iran earlier. And we still don't have a full picture of the extent of the outbreak in Iran or its impacts. There they have a very restricted internet regime, and in fact the government has closed down the internet for days at a time altogether. Their access to outside sources can be very limited, and so that meant that there was a lot of misinformation spreading inside Iran initially, which may have worsened the outbreak and certainly led to people taking measures that were inadvisable and hurt their health. Russia is another country where we are definitely not seeing the full extent of the virus, and I think that may become a concern further down the road. Russia right now is reporting only 4,000 cases, and just given the countries that it borders on and the number of interactions between Russia and those countries, it beggars belief that is the number of cases they have at this point in time. So we'll see how that plays out. And of course, in the United States, we have not been immune to pitfalls, and certainly it is no secret that our testing apparatus was definitely behind, and that we still don't have a full picture of the extent of the virus and the full number of people who are infected in this country. So it is on a spectrum. Somewhere like China and Iran, both countries have actually activated internet police who look on the internet actively for information about either a new virus that is spreading from human to human in China's case, or just about COVID-19 in both countries' cases, and not only take down that content, but then activate local police to go and in person, in real life, find the people who posted that content and pressure them to take it down under threat. So, when we're looking at what is happening in Western countries where there were failings with testing technology and the rollout of testing and failures on the part of political leaders, I think that's unfortunate, but it's not exactly on the same scale. And to the extent that that has been occurring in Western countries and in other countries with free and open internet, a saving grace is that has been openly and extensively talked about online and in the media.
Well, thank you. So let's see. So I guess this could either be for both of you or, yeah, probably for both of you. So clearly this is a really rapidly changing situation, this crisis. And we're seeing more and more people kind of look at the same sort of issue in terms of how the internet is helping or perhaps hurting in some regards some of our response to this disease. So what sort of changes have you seen over even the last 2 weeks since we published this brief that are looking at this issue? Are there examples of countries or entities who are trying to address it?
Yeah, I can give a sense from kind of the social media side. So this was something we kind of dealt with even as we were writing the brief, is that on kind of a daily basis, we would see new changes for steps that various tech companies were doing. So within like the last week, right before we published, we started seeing stories like Facebook partnering with the World Health Organization and other public health organizations to provide them with free ad space. We saw Google starting to put up kind of alerts at the top of their search results if you search for coronavirus related things. so yeah, so it's been an ongoing change as people have learned how to address it, how to as the virus has spread, we've also seen kind of techniques spread as well, and so it's kind of an ongoing iteration of tech companies really kind of looking at how to combat the misinformation, how to design their kind of fact checking and guidelines for flagging misinformation, or in the case of Twitter has kind of progressively ramped up how aggressive it is about removing tweets altogether. And so yeah, there's kind of that ongoing iteration and change on the social media side of things.
Yes, and with respect to digital epidemiology, I think this is a term that very few people, if anyone, knew a few weeks ago, and it's gaining a lot of currency right now. There are massive collaborations going on right now around the world between epidemiologists, statisticians, sociologists, governments, and companies that possess data. And in fact, my own understanding of the numbers of, or the group of companies that possess data that could be used in this fight is expanding rapidly as we see more and more companies stepping forward. And so I think the big movement is not only in that space, and not only are we seeing more of those people who have been doing that work in the past come to the fore and offer their guidance now, and also seeing tech companies and companies that own data providing certain analysis, like that some of you may have seen, such as Unicast's analysis of mobility in the U.S. right now in response in the last month, and how we're faring with respect to social distancing. But we're now seeing some fairly serious conversations around real-time mobility tracking. Mobility tracking that might be on a very, either on an aggregated anonymized level, such as the Unicast analysis, or something a little more sophisticated and a little more accurate. But we're also seeing discussions around creating opt-in apps that would allow people to voluntarily provide their location data, so that they can be notified should they come into contact with people who have the virus or who have been in close contact with someone who has the virus. That there was, as of a week ago, that had only been seen in Israel. Now we are seeing that the EU has announced that it will be rolling something like that out this month. And there are certainly some concerns about how that would be used and what would happen to the data that is shared through those apps, and what the protections for privacy would be through those apps. And the other thing we are seeing now is fairly serious conversations about applying, accessing and using mobility data to control people's movements going forward, if we are able to return to a level of infection in the United States where containment again becomes a possibility, where we want certain people who with the virus or who have been exposed to the virus to stay at home. Scott Gottlieb, who is the former FDA commissioner, published a fairly serious policy proposal last week with AEI, saying that we could only move out of our current state of social distancing and stay-at-home orders into more freedom of movement if we are keeping tabs via cell phone location data on those people who have the virus, and using that data to keep them at home, which of course gives rise to a whole host of civil liberty and privacy concerns. So there's a lot of movement in this space. And I think, one of my students told me several weeks ago that his parents had been had been comforting him with a simple phrase, which is, in this virus, in this epidemic, what seemed reasonable yesterday no longer seems reasonable today, and what didn't seem reasonable yesterday does seem reasonable today. So that's all to say that our assessment of what a reasonable measure would be is changing all the time with our appreciation of both the severity of the health risk posed by this epidemic and the severity of the economic risk posed by this epidemic. So we have to be very alive to the fact that our appetite for using data that in a way that is not privacy protective, and our appetite for using data in a way that treads on civil liberties is subject to change, and we need to be very, very careful as we're doing that and not rally around those suggestions that may cross lines.
Cool. I have two audience questions here, which are kind of similar, so I'm going to try to group them into one. So one of the questions is, are there any sort of guidelines, either here in the US or perhaps internationally, that would help policymakers and tech companies filter out misinformation, but that could cross over into something that could be considered censorship? And then a related question there is, how should or how might tech companies respond if a government might be spreading misinformation purposely? For complete transparency, the person asked, how should tech companies respond to a US president who spreads xenophobia and misinformation? But I think we can take that kind of a little more broadly as well.
Yeah, so in terms of frameworks for governments kind of taking down misinformation, I don't think there's any strong ones, at least in the US. China, obviously, as Sarah mentioned, has done a lot of censorship efforts there and is taking things down. Within the US, though, I don't think we should expect the government to take that role of kind of taking down misinformation. I think the general approach to speech is, you combat bad information with good information. And so I think in terms of frameworks, I think we really need to build up how the government actually disseminates information across social media. And so in terms of guidelines for that, there are a few that kind of float around. One that comes to mind is the Department of Homeland Security actually has a guideline for kind of best practices for using social media during emergency situations. And so they look at kind of how things like Twitter and Facebook were used to coordinate responses during Hurricane Sandy, as well as a few other disasters. And from that kind of came up with some guidelines for like what worked well, how to actually kind of make sure the government information is getting out there in a way that is relevant and can actually compete with the kind of rush of misinformation. And so I think that's kind of where the focus should be from the government side of things, is not trying to take down misinformation, but rather trying to combat it by ensuring that government agencies or public health agencies have an active presence and are kind of utilizing social media to the best of their abilities to actually get information in front of people. And then in terms of tech companies and how they should respond, excuse me, that gets a little bit more open. So for instance, I know Twitter has recently been taking down some tweets from Rudy Giuliani, who obviously has close ties to the president, for misinformation that they deem to be harmful or kind of too wrong to let stay up. And I think to some extent that's fine. I think if tech companies are going to do that, they should very clearly have a framework for doing that beforehand, so that they're not kind of deciding on the fly what is and isn't acceptable. It should be kind of a clear framework of where the line is for what can stay and what can't, and they should make that clear to their users. And so the alternative, if we're using Twitter as an example, again, not to harp on them, but I know recently they kind of rolled out a plan for dealing with deep fakes. So videos where people kind of use AI to manipulate, speech or people's faces or whatever, so to make it look like someone's saying something they didn't. And they just kind of have a simple system where they can kind of tag posts that they've identified as being misleading or altered as such. And I think approaches like that are actually more along the lines of what we should see.
Sarah, did you want to add anything there, or I can go on to another question?
Yes, I would just say that, in general, the American approach to censorship has been to censor as little information as possible, only that which actively endangers people. The term in First Amendment law is the only thing we really want to censor is the equivalent of someone going into a crowded theater and shouting fire, which might cause a stampede. And so similarly, I think that the tech companies would want to take a page from that, and as Brian said, come up with frameworks ahead of time. Obviously, frameworks can't anticipate every case, but they are enormously helpful, and that would lay out some rules for what is being taken down. What we've seen in this epidemic is that the tech companies who are taking down certain information are saying that it violates their community standards, and their community standards are that people should not be posting information that actively endangers or harms other people. So I think something like that needs to be elaborated on, so that next time around we're not making the rules on the fly as they are right now, but that it is well understood ex ante. And it's possible that one thing the tech companies could consider is working with outside experts who would help come up with the framework and guide the work of those people who are taking that content down.
Thank you. So another audience question, which I think actually ties into a question that somebody submitted when they were submitting their registration. So the two questions are, one of them is, how do we ensure that underrepresented groups could have a voice in discussions of epidemic policy as it relates to this? And then the related question is, if there is all this good online information and resources, who exactly is that supposed to help? How can we make sure that that online information reaches an offline audience in a way that they could understand?
So I'll jump into that, and then I'll toss it over to Brian. I think that making sure that everybody has a voice in the policies being generated in response to this pandemic is critically important, and that points to not only an open, ensuring that the internet as it exists is open, but ensuring equity of access to the internet. So in the United States, that might look like seriously considering barriers to access for groups that are lower on the socioeconomic scale or underrepresented groups, and rolling out more broadband access in rural areas. And around the world, that might look like ensuring funding and ensuring the development of better internet infrastructure and access to 4G and 5G networks. I think that there are also responsibilities incumbent upon everyone who is contributing to the policy process to make sure that they are considering not just people like themselves, but people in different positions. So for instance, even with the task of educating the Duke community that we are undertaking right now, we have given thought along the way to who has access to the online material, how to react and make sure that if they are not able to, for instance, access classes in real time through Zoom because of limitations on their internet access, that we are providing alternate means of accessing the same information through recordings or transcripts of lectures, that sort of thing. So and this is where I will toss it back over to Brian, but I think we're seeing people are trying things and evaluating and reevaluating efforts to get the right information out to all sectors of the population, everyone who might be affected. So in a lighter, on a lighter note, what you're seeing is efforts to get stuff out through TikTok and YouTube and reach out through influencers. And, Anthony Fauci has made himself available for YouTube interviews with people who reach millennials and college students because there was such an urgent need that became apparent to get the right information out about the seriousness of the coronavirus to college-age students who may not have been taking the epidemic seriously. So I think that what we'll see, on the other end of the spectrum, there has to be an effort to make sure that elderly people who do not have smartphones and do not necessarily use the internet on a regular basis still have access to all the information they need. So I think that's that will be something, one of the things that Brian recommended that is critically important is that we stop at some point at the end of this and evaluate all of the efforts that were made and what type of reach they had, and sort of commit that to memory and commit that to a policy playbook for the next time around.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I think part of the question was, for people who are offline or don't have access to this online information, how do you reach them? Admittedly, we kind of tossed around some ideas behind the scenes when we were working on this about that, and decided it kind of goes beyond the scope. There's a whole separate kind of area of work in terms of how do you reach people and communicate with people. But I do think there have been historic standards. We haven't always had the internet, so we can kind of look at past efforts to engage with people during crises. We could start considering things. We have like 911 for like day-to-day emergency situations. So maybe we could consider something like a 3-digit kind of emergency line for public health emergencies that people can call into to get kind of updates or kind of recent information about that or their risks or whatever. And so I do think there is room and there's a base of knowledge out there for how to actually reach and communicate with people offline when they don't have access to the internet or social media or anything like that. And so I'm not familiar with it enough to say what those recommendations are or what we should take from it. But I think it's important to be aware that it's there, and it's definitely something that can be leaned on and incorporated moving forward, rather than just kind of putting all your eggs in the internet basket. And then, yeah, I think the first part of the question was, how do we ensure disadvantaged people have a voice in this? I think one kind of interesting aspect of this is as kind of cases grow, you're seeing a lot of people struggle to have access to healthcare and things like that as beds fill up, resources are stretched thin. And so I think at some level you're going to see a lot of people who have historically never struggled with access to healthcare suddenly see that struggle. And I think if we can get those people to be aware that for a lot of people this is just kind of a daily struggle and an ongoing struggle that is not unique to this crisis, I think that would go a long way in terms of ensuring that things can be done for disadvantaged people moving forward.
Awesome, great. So a few more audience questions that have come in, some interesting ones. I'll try to get to all of them in the time we've got. Yeah, so there's two here that actually I think are kind of similar. One I'll kind of read verbatim. Seeing that there's so much information accessible to everyone and practicing non-linear reading habits, such as jumping from one page or information source to another, is kind of commonly becoming practiced now. Do you believe that the public may collect bits and pieces of their chosen information resources and create their own perception of this pandemic? And a related question is, do you think that even like prior knowledge or personal beliefs might play a part in exacerbating the miscommunication of information?
Yeah, so I don't even think people have to necessarily jump from one source to another to kind of, reinforce their beliefs. We already see things like Facebook's algorithm will kind of prioritize things that you have a tendency to click on. Google's search algorithm will prioritize things that you're more likely to click on, things like that. And so we already know that social media kind of caters to people's preferences there. And so I don't think you even have to jump around from source to source. I do think that means that when you're trying to combat misinformation, you can't just have, the CDC can't just like put a post up on Facebook and one up on Twitter and like call it a day. They have to be cognizant of the fact that there are a huge number of platforms, and they have to really kind of work to actually engage with all of them. So.
Yeah, and I'll add to that there is a role to be played on the other side, which is the social media companies and the media, in continually pointing people back to the same experts, to expert organizations, and to people who are producing good evidence-based information. And so to the extent that we can, having those groups reach out through multiple platforms, have the platforms reach back to them, and have the media continually put those types of experts forward is critically important. Obviously, Dr. Fauci's been working overtime. He has barely a shred of a voice left right now, but I personally do see CDC information every time I do a Google search related to coronavirus. It pops up in my Facebook. It's coming at me from all sides, and to the extent that we can complete that saturation, I think that's critically important. The other part of that question is, are people going to assimilate the information in a way that just reinforces their prior beliefs and their prior knowledge? Absolutely. We understand now that just human psychology means that we tend to select to commit to our memories information that reinforces our pre-existing notions of the way the world works. To a certain extent, there's nothing we can do about that. That's the way the brain works. But again, the best tool we have to combat that is to just put out good information and continually promote it.
Great. One other question here from the audience. The one's a little shorter. What are considered some of the biggest threats surrounding the derailing of valid information?
I can speak to that just a little bit, and then I think Brian probably has a little more to say on that, which is that that public health experts have been most concerned about misinformation that falls into a few buckets. The first is misinformation that tends to downplay the seriousness of the crisis, so that people are not taking adequate measures to protect themselves. So that could, again, that runs the gamut from, initial lack of information about the ability of the virus to spread from human to human, lack of information about the full spectrum of people affected, to politicians' statements about the lack of seriousness of the epidemic, of the illness that people can contract, and various reports online that downplay the seriousness. And the other thing that they are concerned about from a public health perspective is misinformation that might tend to promote therapies or cures or tools that are not going to actually protect people against the virus, so that or could actively hurt them. So there are some horror stories out there about people drinking bleach and doing other very inadvised things based on bad information they saw online. Hopefully that is, you know, by far the minority of people who are doing that. But what we're more concerned about is things like people buying sanitizers for their UV light sanitizers for their phone with no proven efficacy, or trying out or masks that are counterfeit, or trying out various cures or therapies that don't hurt them per se, but give them the false illusion that they are protected, and so that they go out and continue to expose themselves to the virus and then continue to expose others to it. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I can just kind of echo that. I think in terms of like the dangers of derailing valid information, I mean, if you think about like the ideal policy response of being this kind of like sweet spot of like, how do you respond to this virus? You know, you can imagine if people don't take it seriously enough because they read a bunch of false information about how dangerous it is, how safe they are, what the risks are, whatever, and they kind of undervalue like how impactful this pandemic can be. You know, that can really counteract a lot of attempts for like social distancing, for instance. If like people don't believe it's a threat, they're not going to buy into this very large scale, very kind of intense social distancing project we've kind of all undertaken. But then kind of on the other side, you know, if you get misinformation that kind of overplays the seriousness, then you kind of get into the, you know, where we kind of started at the beginning of this talk, where Sarah mentioned that, you know, there are our opinions and kind of appetite and willingness to think about certain kind of sacrifices of privacy in the name of kind of stronger responses to this. That becomes more likely if you kind of oversell the risks too. And so I think it's very important if you can't, misinformation isn't just like underplaying the risks, it can also include overplaying it. And both the dangers for both of those is either kind of, you know, limiting our ability to actually respond to this, or increasing the ability of, you know, people to take advantage of this and over respond in some way. So.
Great. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll have time for maybe just probably about 2 more questions. So another question that came early on when people were submitting their RSVPs, what are some of the key takeaway points from these various communication efforts around COVID that we've been discussing that might be applicable to other large-scale risks? I guess if we think about that in the policy space, how are we going to, you know, learn from this, not just for future epidemics, but even for other future crises?
I think one of the most important things to learn is how impactful some of these kind of partnerships we're starting to see form between tech companies and government agencies can be. It took several weeks for, you know, Facebook and World Health Organization to come to some, you know, free ad space agreement, or it took time for the CDC to get their, you know, kind of alerts up on social media and things like that. And so I think an important takeaway is that these partnerships can be very, very important in terms of actually informing people, and they should be established early, and ideally before a crisis, so that, you know, you don't waste time establishing a partnership. You can really kind of identify a crisis and really like hit the ground running in your ability to kind of inform the public about it, instead of wasting time figuring out how to inform the public.
And some of the lessons to be learned about what is the most impactful, we're not going to be able to learn in real time on the fly right now. And so one of the recommendations that we made in the report is that the groups who are engaging in these efforts keep fairly good records of what they're doing, so that they can go back and reevaluate once the dust settles. These, you know, do the type of metrics and analysis that traditional advertisers do to evaluate who was reached, how far the penetration into their desired audiences was, who was missed, and that sort of thing, so that the best practices can be decided upon in a calmer moment, and committed to some sort of document or policy playbook for the future.
Great. And yeah, so let's kind of end on a pretty open-ended question. I think this has been a lot of great information to hear, and definitely have appreciated all the audience questions. Is there any other things that have been on your mind related to this issue about information sharing around this crisis that we haven't talked about yet that you would like to share with us? All right, stump them.
I would just say that for me, the issue that is really top of mind at the moment is how we are going to make sure that all of the data sharing that is occurring right now in real time is being done in a privacy protective way and in a way that doesn't tread on civil liberties. I think that's really critical. We have a lot of longstanding players in this space. Digital epidemiology, depending on how you look at it, is about 12 to 20 years old as a field. There are responsible groups that have been working in this space for a very long time. A group of researchers out of Harvard, Princeton, and the University of Florida who collaborate with governments around the world and certain tech companies harvesting mobility data in order to help governments who are dealing with things like Zika and Ebola and other emerging epidemics figure out how it's going to spread, figure out the best way to reach people, figure out whether the measures that they are imposing are working. But those researchers operate under ethical frameworks within their universities, and to the extent that they are pulling in governments or working with governments, the frameworks also apply to them. So what we're seeing right now is a lot of work being done on the fly by people who are new to the space, companies who have a fair amount of information. And again, you know, there were a lot of concerns before this pandemic about data privacy and the use of people's data. So we would really need to make sure that in our rush to share information and to gain control of this, that we are doing it in a privacy protected way, and not just say, okay, well, we're all good because we're sharing anonymized and aggregated data, but make sure that we're interrogating what that means, what our definition of anonymity is, what our definition of aggregated is, and make sure that when those as defined for a certain project are applied, that it's not, that the information doesn't become invasive. And I think that, you know, I'd say just a week before Italy shut down the country and confined people to their homes, most of us thought that would never happen in a Western democracy. They could do that in China. They would never do that in a Western democracy. Then it happened in Italy, and we thought, okay, they did that in Italy, but that's because their cases are so extreme. And now 3/4 of the U.S. population are subject to that at the moment. We all understand that's really for the duration of this epidemic, but we are making choices right now that are choices for this epidemic because of this epidemic. And so it is becoming more and more of a possibility that we may be speaking about surveilling individual people based on their cell phone and location data. And that is something we have to be extremely careful about, how we go about doing that. If we go about doing that, it must be done within a framework that is very limited and ensures that the data will be destroyed after the fact.
Yeah, and for me, I think something that we haven't really talked about is, you know, a lot of our recommendations for disinformation and misinformation come down to what, you know, government agencies, tech companies, et cetera, can do. And I think that's good. There's obviously like a huge role for them to play. But I also think there's definitely a conversation to be had about the general public itself being actively consuming information instead of kind of passively just like taking in whatever's on your screen in front of you and accepting it. And so, you know, if we're going to ask tech companies or the government to do all the heavy lifting in terms of like ensuring information in front of us is accurate, I think that's kind of problematic and starts kind of drifting down towards, you know, more extreme ideas of kind of censorship and things like that, where we rely on other people to tell us to do the work for us and make the decisions for us about what to trust and what not to. And so I do think there's an aspect of this that does kind of center around how do you get the general public to kind of engage and be more active in consuming information, so that you don't have to rely on these other players to kind of do the work for them.
Great. Well, I think we'll cut it there. We're just about at 1:30. Thank you to all the audience questions. We had a lot of really great questions, and I apologize that I wasn't able to get to all of them. But as Tim was saying at the beginning, you are welcome to reach out to us, and we can definitely continue this conversation. Thank you again as well to Sarah Rispin Sedlack and Brian Langloss for all the insights and the discussion today. Again, definitely encourage our audience to go to scipaul.org to, if you haven't yet, to take a look at their brief and read more about some of their ideas and recommendations. And so again, this is the first of this series that we're aiming to kind of continue throughout the next few weeks. We will have our next event on April 10th, and that will be called Science Communication in the Age of Coronavirus. And so we hope to see many of you all there for that conversation. So again, thank you very much, and I hope you all have a good day.